The clock read 2:14. In the morning, when Richard Donovan pushed his cleaning cart down the fourth-floor hallway of Sterling Tower, the way he did every night for the past 4 years, the building was quiet at this hour. Nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the elevator shaft. Richard liked it that way. After his wife passed, silence had become something he no longer feared. It was the only place where his mind could rest, where he didn't have to perform strength for his 8-year-old son, Noah, waiting for him at home with his grandmother. Richard had been an accountant once, a good one, working for a mid-sized firm before the recession swallowed his company whole and left him scrambling for anything that could keep food on the table and his son in school shoes. Cleaning offices at Sterling Tower wasn't glamorous, but it paid on time, and nobody asked him questions about his past. He came in quietly, did his work, and left before the sun rose high enough for the executives to notice him. That particular night, everything about Sterling Tower felt different. Richard noticed it the moment he stepped off the service elevator. The usually empty executive floor was buzzing with tension. Phones rang unanswered at empty desks. A woman from HR was crying quietly by the copy machine. Security guards stood near the elevators, looking like they didn't know whether they still had jobs to protect. At the center of it all, in the glass-walled corner office that belonged to Elena Marsh, founder and CEO of Marsh Capital Holdings, sat the only person who wasn't moving. Elena sat perfectly still behind her enormous mahogany desk, staring at a blank computer screen, her phone lying face down beside her, as if she couldn't bear to see one more notification. She was still dressed in her tailored charcoal blazer from that morning's board meeting, though her blouse's top button was undone, and her usually perfect chignon had come loose, strands falling messily around her face. Richard had seen Elena Marsh maybe a handful of times in 4 years, always from a distance, always moving fast between meetings, with the kind of confidence that made people scatter out of her way. She'd built her investment firm from nothing, an orphaned girl from Ohio with no family money, no connections, nothing but sheer will, into one of the most respected financial firms in the country. Forbes had put her on their cover twice. She'd been called the most powerful woman in finance under 40. Tonight, she looked like none of that mattered anymore. Richard wasn't supposed to be on this floor this early. Usually he started with the lower levels and worked his way up, but tonight the schedule felt irrelevant. He'd overheard enough fragments from the panicked employees rushing past him to piece together the shape of what was happening. A short position taken by a rival firm, a leaked internal memo, a regulatory investigation announced without warning. By morning, Marsh Capital's stock had cratered 90%, wiping out not just Elena's company but her entire personal fortune, most of which had been tied up in company shares as collateral for expansion loans she'd personally guaranteed. In one night, Elena Marsh had gone from being worth nearly $2 billion to being underwater on debts she couldn't possibly repay. Richard parked his cart outside her office, debating whether to simply skip the room entirely and let her have her privacy. But something about the stillness of her posture, the emptiness in her eyes as she stared at nothing, reminded him too much of himself 4 years ago, sitting in his car in a hospital parking lot after signing away his wife's DNR order, feeling like the entire world had gone silent around him, while everyone else kept moving. He knocked softly on the open door frame. "Ms. Marsh, I can come back later if you need the room." She looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten anyone else existed in the building. For a moment she simply stared at him, the janitor she'd probably passed 100 times, without truly seeing, and something in her expression cracked just slightly. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice hoarse. "Clean it. Doesn't matter what happens to this office anymore anyway." Richard hesitated, then stepped inside, but instead of reaching for his supplies, he pulled out the spare chair across from her desk and sat down, uninvited. It probably would have gotten him fired on any other night. Tonight, he didn't think anyone was paying attention to rules anymore. "I heard what happened," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Elena let out a hollow, humorless laugh. "Everyone downstairs is sorry too. Sorry they're losing their jobs. Sorry they trusted me. Sorry they invested their pensions in a company that just evaporated overnight." She pressed her palms against her eyes. "I built this from nothing. 20 years and it's gone in 6 hours." "What happened?" Richard asked, not out of curiosity, but because he sensed she needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't going to sue her or fire her or ask her for a severance package. She told him about the short seller campaign, about the leaked memo taken out of context, about the regulators who'd shown up without warning, demanding records that would take weeks to properly explain. Weeks she didn't have, because the market didn't wait for explanations. She talked about the loans, the collateral, the way her entire net worth had been a house of cards built on borrowed confidence, and how one strong gust of doubt had been enough to bring the whole structure down. I don't even have anywhere to sleep tonight, she admitted, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. My condo is leveraged against company assets. My accounts are frozen pending investigation. I have $400 in a checking account and a car that isn't even paid off. She looked at Richard, really looked at him, maybe for the first time. I don't even know your name. Richard, he said. Richard Donovan. I'm sorry, Richard, she said, and for the first time that night, her voice cracked completely. I'm sitting here, falling apart in front of the janitor because everyone else who called themselves my friends stopped answering my calls 3 hours ago. That's usually how it goes, Richard said simply. People stick around for what you can give them. Not many stick around for what you're going through. Something about his tone, calm, unpitying, matter of fact, made Elena study him more closely. You sound like you know that from experience. Richard hesitated, then found himself telling her about his wife, about the accounting job he'd lost, about the slow, humiliating slide from a corner cubicle to a cleaning cart, about how the same colleagues who used to invite him to dinner parties stopped returning his calls within a month of his layoff. It's not really about the money, he said. It's about finding out who actually saw you as a person instead of a position. Elena sat with that for a long moment, the office silent except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. So what do? When everything falls apart? You get up the next morning anyway, Richard said, not because you feel like it, because somebody's counting on you to. He didn't offer to fix her problems. He couldn't, but he stayed. He finished cleaning the office slowly, deliberately, giving her the dignity of not being watched too closely while she pulled herself back together. And when his shift ended near dawn, he found her still sitting there, having nowhere else to go. You could come by our place, Richard offered, feeling strange even as he said it, just for tonight. My mother-in-law is staying with us to help with my son, but we've got a pull-out couch. It's not much, but it's warm, and nobody there is going to ask you for anything. Elena almost refused out of reflexive pride, the same pride that had built her empire and now had nothing left to protect. But something about the exhaustion in her bones, the complete absence of any other option, made her nod instead. That night, in Richard's small 2-bedroom apartment, Elena Marsh, former billionaire, Forbes cover subject, a woman who had once negotiated $100 million deals without blinking, sat at a scratched kitchen table eating reheated spaghetti while Richard's son Noah told her, entirely unprompted, about his class hamster named Sir Reginald. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena laughed, a real laugh, not the practice kind she used at investor dinners. In the weeks that followed, Elena's world contracted into something almost unrecognizable. The investigation into Marsh Capital dragged through the press. Most of the accusations eventually proven exaggerated or outright false, but by the time regulators cleared her personally of any wrongdoing, the company itself was already dissolved, its assets liquidated, its name reduced to a case study in business school lectures about market panic. Elena found herself, for the first time since she was 19 years old, without a company, without a title, without the identity she had spent 2 decades constructing. She stayed with Richard's family longer than either of them planned. First a week, then a month, splitting rent once. She found temporary work doing bookkeeping for a small, local business that had no idea their new hire used to run a $2 billion firm. She learned to budget grocery trips the way she once budgeted acquisition deals, learned Noah's school pickup schedule, learned the particular quiet comfort of Richard's presence, a man who never once asked her to explain herself or perform gratitude for the roof over her head. It was Richard who noticed, months later, the quiet brilliance still buried underneath. Elena's exhaustion, the way she effortlessly restructured the local bookkeeping client's finances, saving them from a tax penalty that would have crippled their small business. It was Richard who gently suggested that maybe her talent hadn't disappeared along with her fortune, that maybe it had simply been waiting for a reason worth rebuilding for. Elena started small, advising the same struggling local business, owners who couldn't afford the fees of the big consulting firms she used to run circles around, people who reminded her, in their scrappy determination, of who she'd been before the money changed the shape of her ambition. Word spread slowly through the community about the woman who used to run a major firm now helping small businesses survive, charging fees scaled to what people could actually afford. What began as survival work slowly became something like purpose. A year after the collapse of Marsh Capital, Elena founded a small advisory firm, nothing like the empire she'd lost, deliberately smaller, deliberately different, focused on helping the kind of struggling entrepreneurs who would never have made it past her old firm's front desk. She named it, without much fanfare, Donovan Marsh Advisory, over Richard's embarrassed protests that he'd done nothing to deserve. His name on the letterhead. You gave me somewhere to sleep when I had nothing, Elena told him, the night they signed the paperwork. You didn't know if I'd ever be able to pay you back for that. You stayed anyway. That's worth more than a name on a door, but it's the least I can give you. Their relationship, which had grown slowly and carefully from that first strange night in her collapsing office, deepened into something neither of them had been looking for, but both had quietly needed, not built on Elena's old wealth or Richard's stability, but on the simple fact that each had seen the other at their most stripped down, most human, and had chosen to stay anyway. 2 years after the collapse of Marsh Capital, Elena Marsh stood at a much smaller company holiday party in a rented office space above a hardware store, surrounded by a dozen employees who had once been small business owners on the edge of failure, now thriving under her guidance. Noah, now 10 years old, ran between the tables with a paper crown from the office Secret Santa exchange, calling Elena Aunt Elena the way he had for over a year now. Though everyone in the room understood, the title meant something closer to family than the word technically implied. Richard watched from across the room, a mug of cheap eggnog in his hand. No longer a janitor, Elena had insisted, once the firm was stable enough, that he join as operations manager, work that used his old accounting background in ways the recession had never allowed. He wasn't rich, not by any measure that mattered to his old life before the layoff, but he was steady, and steady, he'd learned, was worth more than anything he'd lost in that first collapse years ago. When Elena caught his eye across the room, she smiled, not the practiced, camera-ready smile she used to wear on magazine covers, but something quieter, more real, the kind of smile that belonged to a woman who had lost everything and discovered, in the wreckage, something she hadn't known she was missing. Not an empire, but a home. To second chances, she said later that night, raising her glass to the small room of people who had rebuilt something together out of nothing. To second chances, Richard echoed, and Noah, not quite understanding the weight of the toast but eager to participate, raised his cup of apple juice just as high. Outside, snow fell quietly over the small office building. Nothing like the glass towers Elena used to command from her corner suite, but warmer somehow, in every way that mattered. She had lost her empire in one night, but in the wreckage of everything she'd built, she found the one thing money had never been able to buy her. Someone who stayed, not for what she could offer, but simply because she needed someone to. And this time, when she rebuilt, she built it on something that could never collapse overnight again.